Hey folks, how's it going today? Good. All right. Before we get started on today's topic, I want to talk about something that I've just created. So this is going to be a little bit confusing, and part of it is because it's the first time I've ever done anything like this before. But I got some advice from some very, very knowledgeable individuals, and I think that we're on board with this. So I wanted to go ahead and go through this. So I was working on posting assignments for a couple weeks in advance. As you know, we're in week 6. I post a week 8, and I just finished the week 8 activity. Now, the first part of the week 8 activity is not particularly different. It's we're moving into investigations, and we're going to be answering questions and working together in groups as we do that. The second part of the activity is a little bit difficult, though, and I just realized a problem with this, but I won't go into it. But anyway, individual questions and group questions that relates to these concepts. But you'll notice that when you get down to the area of the activity, it says RTBC Part 1 examination. And I've only got 18 people assigned to groups. And so you can see RTBC Part 1 is associated or is a separate assignment. Basically, what we're going to be doing instead of our cases where everybody gets up, presents PowerPoints and talks about different things, we're actually going to be doing an investigation. And RTBC stands for Return of the Tallahassee Bean Counters. So everybody remember the Tallahassee Bean Counters from the beginning of the semester? There's a second case, which is set in the same universe. So I guess it's just a different universe because it's the same characters, I guess I should say. But you're supposed to assume that the events of the Tallahassee Bean Counters never happened. So it's basically going to be a different scenario, different fraud, same characters as before, though. I figured it would be fun for the next 3 weeks, or for me, weeks 8, 9, and 10, to actually have the class conduct an investigation. Now, that being said, I felt that this was too big an undertaking for me to try to handle by myself, because this is going to be partially stuff that we're going to be doing in class and the stuff that we're going to be doing out of class. Fortunately, Matt and Kirsten have been working with me, and they volunteered their efforts to actually assist me. So they're going to be kind of standing as outsiders to this, which they're going to be assisting with this. And basically, the idea is that everybody in the class is going to read the investigation case. It's been already posted on Brightspace. And then we're going to be doing an actual investigation in 3 parts. The first part of the investigation is going to be the inquiry step of the investigation. We're going to be doing the examination step. So you'll read through the case, you'll say, all right, here's what I'd like to know more about, and you're going to make requests. And everybody's been assigned to either Matt or Kirsten to respond. I will tell you, I will also be involved in the process. I'm not just going to say, all right, have fun, everybody, and just abandon it into the winds. I will actually be involved in coordinating requests as well, and we'll step in as necessary. But you will set it out, requires a request for information, multiple steps and multiple points. There won't be any presentations, and instead you're going to be graded on whether or not your group completes the request step. Week 9, I have not prepared it yet, but just as a spoiler for week 9, week 9 is actually going to be an interrogation, or I guess what's the word I'm looking for? Interview. That's a better word for it. An interview. So the contacts that you're going to be working with, you're going to have actually a 20-minute window during class on the Tuesday after to perform an interview. And it can be anybody, any of the characters in the case. It can be multiple characters if you want to talk to multiple characters, but there's going to be a little bit of role play where you, as the interviewers, will interrogate the people that you want to ask questions about and get information. And that's going to be kind of the next step of that. And the final step is going to be the wrap up, where we issue the examination or the investigation report and try to determine the extent of the fraud that's occurred. So it's going to be taking place over 3 weeks. I do not anticipate that it's going to go perfectly the first time around. There are going to be steps. It's going to be a learning process. But I do want to make sure everybody knows what's going to be happening. I've already signed the groups out for this. So you can see it's 20 people in the class, but 2 of them are going to be working with me on the project. So there's 18 people left. I signed you to kind of groups that you'll be working with for the entire 3-week period. You will be rotating as group leaders over the 3-week period. So persons, the group leader in week 8 will be responsible for the week 8 deliverables. Week 9 will be responsible for the week 9 deliverables, so on and so forth. But you'll be working with those groups. And so keep that in mind as we're moving forward. I do strongly recommend that you don't wait till the day before the investigation to read the case. It is a big case. The reason I'm bringing this up now is so that everybody starts looking through it and reading through it. The case itself is not that long, but there's a lot of associated materials. It's just like the original Tallahassee Bean Counters case. It's got a lot of content. So you want to start thinking about red flags and concerns now so that you'll be up to speed on it. But again, it's not coming up for 2 weeks, but I wanted to make everybody aware now that this is available and start reading, start thinking about it, and start getting prepared for that. Yeah. Also, as a quick note, kind of an afterthought, we do have some people who have signed up for the 3MT competition. The deadline for that is going to be on Friday. So that'd be just tomorrow, the deadline for signing up for that. Now, remember that the prize for if you participate in that is that you actually get a free 15 out of 15. I don't want to say that people are saying it's not necessary. The quizzes have been easy. I'm just going to caution you, the quizzes are about to get a whole lot harder. Okay. And that's not because I'm trying to make them harder to try to motivate you. It's more along the lines of the cases were supplementing the quizzes previously, because basically you read the cases and I told you something that was in the case and you're just like, okay, I remember reading that in the case and the case is easy. Because of the fact that we're going to be doing an investigation in a few weeks, I'm not going to have cases to supplement that. So I'm going to be asking you facts about the stuff that we studied during the week, and it's going to be a lot more technical in detail. So if you were just kind of saying, I don't need that extra 15 to 15, I based all the quizzes so far. Well, first of all, congratulations. Okay. Secondly, everybody can use a free 15 out of 15. So please consider that as an option if you have that, have not already. All right. Let's get started on this week's topic. So talking about fraud prevention and deterrence. And I do think it's kind of interesting when we talk about deterrence. We're going to get into a little bit more detail about that, but I'm a big detractor of deterrence. I think I made that point clear last week, but the idea of deterrence is kind of minimalistic in my mind, simply because I don't think that punishment is particularly a good deterrent effect, but it is the terminology that's used in this area. So we started out with the COSO Fraud Risk Management Guide, and I'm sure that everybody probably saw the words COSO. It said Dr. Barnes is up to his old shenanigans again. And so for those of you who thought you were getting away from internal controls discussion, that's just too bad. You're never going to get away from it. I promised you. In fact, once you graduate, I'm going to send you periodic emails, and I'm going to send you just the components of the COSO framework to remind you what they are. All right. And yeah, and somebody's gonna have their final laugh. I'm gonna be in my grave, and you're gonna go put my gravestone, you're going to chisel the components of the internal control COSO framework on my gravestone. And I'd just be like, in heaven or wherever I go, thumbs up, just like, well done, well done. All right, so first question, we got into this, we're talking about fraud risk assessment, which is going to lead into what we're going to be presenting today. But first question, I know that most of you answered this question from multiple times now, but I'm going to ask again, what are the 5 components of COSO framework, and briefly define each of these components? And I can think of no better individual to start off this discussion than with one of my audit track students, who probably has heard this a dozen times, if not more. Matt, what are the 5 components of the COSO framework, and briefly describe each one?
All right, you got your control environment, it's on at the top. You got your risk assessment, that's how the entity assesses the risks that may be relevant to the control activities, which are responses to the identified risks. You got information communication, which is them disseminating information about the controls to members of the company so that the controls can work effectively. And you have monitoring, which is them making sure they're keeping an eye on their controls, make sure the controls are working right. If they are, great. If not, then they're revising them and keeping them up.
Okay. Did you get all of them?
That's fine.
It's fine. Okay. I missed control activities. Maybe I was just thinking about something else. I thought, okay, my apologies. Okay, that's a problem with getting old, as you start getting skipping things. I was expecting. I know that Matt's been studying for the CPA exam, so I was expecting CRIME to be the acronym, because that's the acronym they use for Becker, and it is kind of a dumb acronym. But yeah, so Matt did a pretty good job discussing that. Did a really good job, except for the one I missed because I was off daydreaming somewhere. But I for some reason I missed control activities. But my bad. Yeah, so if we're talking about COSO framework, this is kind of the gold standard when we talk about controls. And obviously, this course is not about controls. This course is about fraud, but I do think we need to take into concern security and how this plays a role in fraud prevention and deterrence. And so this is not going to be the backbone of what we're going to be talking about today, but this is going to set the framework for what we will be discussing. So yeah, I do think it's important to remember that. Keep those in mind, because when we start talking about the fraud framework that COSO set up, it's going to look really familiar. It's going to look very, very similar to what we just talked about. All right, so depending on which resource you refer to, a fraud risk assessment will generally involve 5 to 7 steps. Now, the framework that I provided is actually the one from the audit board piece. That's a five-step assessment, which is fine. If you go onto the ACCT Fraud Examiner's Manual, there's a 7-step assessment, and it's not particularly different. It just adds some additional incremental steps. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to use the audit board blog piece as the as our fraud risk assessment steps. So let's go ahead and let's go through each of these and make sure we identify what the steps are. All right, so since we already talked about the COSO framework, I had Matt kind of summarize that. I'm not going to have one person summarize all this. We're going to go one by one on these because these are a lot less familiar. These are a lot less familiar, although they are going to seem similar to something we just talked about. So Maddie, what's our step one and what does it mean? Right, and so this is again. I said we were gonna get away from the COSO framework, but this sure sounds like something from the COSO framework. This is kind of like our entities risk assessment, but this is something that's really important for a fraud risk assessment, because if we need to understand what the risks are in order to identify fraud, then we've got to identify the risks. That's kind of the first step. It's in the name. It's the fraud risk assessment. Identify the risk. Now, Maddie said something really, really important, and something we have to remember is that risks are different between organizations. It has to do with the nature of the organization's operations, the industry which operates in, the nature of the individuals in the organization, both at the highest level and the lowest level in the organization. So some important factors that we have to take in consideration when assessing risk, which is fairly intuitive, but it's still really important to talk about. All right, second step in a fraud risk assessment. Lotus, what'd your group identify? Okay. So in addition to identifying the risk, we have to quantify the risk. So not only do we say this is a risk, but we have to say how significant is this risk? This kind of alludes to things that we've talked about with respect to risks controls before, is that if it's something that we don't think is particularly significant, then it's probably not going to be relevant to a fraud risk assessment. So the significance is important. How likely is the occurrence, and what is the magnitude of something we're considering? So quantification is something really, really important. And we're going to see kind of the likelihood and significance come up again, but the quantification is kind of be involved in both those steps. All right, well, then probably a natural next step is going to be step number 3. Jenna, what did your group say on this one? Yeah, so very similar to what we talked about step 3 in the COSO framework with COSO control activities. We respond to the risks. We know what the risks are. We know how significant they are. We need to respond to them appropriately. So yeah, fairly similar to what we've already talked about, but it's really important to specify and clarify that needs to take place. And my phone is fuzzing out on me. Hold on just a moment. Okay, here we go. Step number 4, Leah, what'd your group say? So the whole monitoring step in the COSO framework we're saying is that things change and we need to be able to adapt to change over time. And if that's the case, then we need to be able to create new controls. And the same holds true when we talk about monitoring and reviewing risks within this framework or this assessment. Then you say, fraud risk assessment, the risks are going to change. Can we adapt? And we need to update our identification and our steps with the nature of changes and the changes in the environment with respect to fraud as well. So very consistent with that. And then finally, Megan, what is step number 5? Okay.
Just making sure you're reporting the risks to the proper people and effectively communicating.
Yeah, so basically making sure that people who need to know and have responsibility for these areas know what their responsibilities are and know what the implications of the fraud are within the organization. All right, so yeah, it feels like we just talked about the same thing twice over, but one of these was a lot more detailed than the others. So we're going to get into a little bit more focus on that, but we're gonna do it again, okay? So basically, we talked about COSO. We just talked about something that sounds very similar to COSO. And now we're going to talk about COSO again. So if I'm one for repetition, because that's how we learn. We repeat things over and over again. So as part of your group questions, I said, I want you to refer to the COSO Fraud Risk Management Guide and what are the 5 fraud risk management principles. All right. And how do these principles align to the components of the COSO internal control integrated framework? So you can kind of see here. And so we've got fraud risk governance, fraud risk assessments, fraud risk control activities, fraud investigation, correction action, fraud risk management and monitoring activities, which is interesting. But if you look down and look at the principles, they actually particularly perfectly align to what we just talked about with COSO. They actually list out the COSO internal control integrated framework components. What is the implication of that? Matt, what'd your group say in there with respect to that?
Well, they are, always, they're inextricably linked because, you know, part of the coastal integrated control framework is found in this, part of this is found in the integrated control framework. It's like two parts of a zipper.
Okay. That's a good analogy. I think it's not what I thought about, but I think that's probably saying they're inextricably linked is probably a good application for that. So we already know with respect to the COSO internal controls integrated framework, that part of controls is being able to address risks and misstatements of the organization. And one of the types of misstatements are those intentional misstatements, which remember from auditing, what do we call an intentional misstatement? Give you hints, the focus of this entire course. Fraud, yes, intentional misstatements focused on fraud. So we already knew that fraud was inextricably linked with the COSO framework, but this kind of is the flip side, saying how do we view fraud? How do we view the risks associated with fraud? And the answer is we already have a template for that. That's the COSO framework. So basically the same thing, although we're going to kind of delineate these a little bit in just a bit. We're going to talk about why is control and fraud not the same thing. Now, I would love it if we could say all we have to learn is controls and to learn fraud, because, you know, you guys know I love talking about internal controls. Some people are going to be sick of it. They're going to be saying, Dr. Barnes, that's all he talks about. And that's not true. I also talk about cheeseburgers, but, you know, everything has its own place in its own time. And there are going to be some things that we can talk about that are going to be separate from others. So as we're talking about right now, there's going to definitely be a strong correlation, but let's go ahead and move to question 4, because we're going to actually specify some differences, some areas that we can actually delineate a little bit. So presumably identified extremely strong correlation between the components in question 1 and principles in question 3. That being the case, why do you think it was necessary for COSO to issue separate fraud risk management guidelines rather than just refer to the components of internal control? So now we're getting into a little bit more of a subjective question, and yeah, that becomes where things start kind of breaking down. So Maddie, you have the first critical thinking question of the day. What did your group say on the first part of question 4?
So they construct upon like identifying fraud within a company.
Right. So I kind of alluded to this already, but when we think about controls, controls are generally considered to be very broad in nature and address all kinds of risks in an organization. Now, if you remember, we talked about this back in auditing. We said that misstatements can be classified in one of 2 ways. We can have intentional misstatements, which we just talked about, those fraud, okay? And then we have unintentional misstatements, which are going to be mistakes and errors. The COSO framework is responsible for trying to address both those types of misstatements, address both those types of risks associated with those misstatements. When we talk about fraud, that is a specific focus. That is one category. Now, can we say that the types of misstatements or the nature of misstatements that would be associated with intentional versus unintentional will differ? Basically, what I'm trying to ask is that if I were to say, give me an example of an intentional misstatement and give me an example of an unintentional misstatement, could you find one that was the same in both those scenarios? Probably not, okay? You probably can't say, all right, here's an example of an unintentional misstatement. It's also an example of an intentional misstatement. Those are very different in nature. So the goal of this particular framework is to say, we need to focus on one category of misstatements, one category of these errors or these issues, not errors, but these issues that come up, and understand what is our focus with this. And the answer is not necessarily clear, because again, we basically use the COSO framework and overlaid it over something. But the goal is trying to say that the nature of fraud is not just the nature of risk. The nature of fraud is not necessarily risk. Now, there are going to definitely be the concepts of risk applicable here. So that's going to be something that is very, very important to be able to differentiate between the two. And that kind of leads into the second question. Are there aspects of fraud risk management that may not be addressed by controls? So in addition to considering the possibility that the COSO framework by itself is not sufficient just to address that concept of fraud, there's the idea that fraud could be broader than, or could be bigger than the concept of controls. So I basically said controls are broader than fraud. Now I'm saying that fraud is broader than controls, which, you know, that's one of those things you're probably thinking, make up your mind, Dr. Barnes, it's one or the other. Not necessarily. We can think about this as a Venn diagram where you think controls are on one oval or one circle, and then fraud is another circle, and there's definitely some overlap there. But there's going to be things that are distinct as well. And so this question is, are there aspects of fraud risk management that might not be addressed by controls? So there's something in the diagram, in this diagram over here for fraud, that will not be part of controls. And I basically said yes, but what am I alluding to? What could I possibly be alluding to? Lotus, another critical thinking question that I throw at your group. Okay.
Pretty much for account control and fraud prevention because they will need to be approached in different ways. The regular person framework doesn't have an investigative element, which is necessary for fraud investigation and prevention.
Okay. So going into a little bit of depth on this, the answer is obviously yes, because I kind of alluded and pushed that direction. Yes, there's going to be something that is not necessarily part of controls that still relates to fraud risk management. Now, a simple example of this is just basically going to be the concepts of limitations on internal controls like collusion. Okay. What did we say when we talked about this in auditing? I said, and I'd actually just recently talked about this in my auditing course. I said, look, these are limitations of controls. It doesn't matter how great you make controls, that there's still a possibility that misstatements will occur because people will bypass the controls because they're going to collude and work together. When we're talking about a fraud risk assessment, is that a sufficient justification for saying that we can't address collusion? So if we know that possibility of fraud exists according to collusion, should we have measures in place to actually address the possibility of collusion? I've said that with respect to controls, this is a limitation. There's nothing we can do about this with respect to controls. But is there something that we would need to do with respect to fraud risk management in that? Or would you be satisfied? Say you're a forensic accountant and you go and talk to your boss or talk to your client and you say, well, here's the deal. Okay. I can't detect a fraud because it's possible that your employees could work together, and that's just beyond my scope and my scale. Okay, if you went to a client and said, yeah, I can't detect fraud if the people collude together, what are they going to say to you? They're going to say you're fired. All right. So we do need to think about things that we necessarily like. This is a very simple example. We said that this is a limitation, something that we can't really address as auditors, but as forensic professionals, we do need to have responsibility for that. And so our procedures need to necessarily change to be able to address these particular problems. So that's something that we have to consider. How do we actually change our approach based on limitations that we'd have previously identified? And again, that's one example, but there's multiple different scenarios we could talk about. This is like saying forensics is not auditing. As much as Dr. Barnes loves to talk about it, forensics and auditing are not the same thing, okay? And that's just hope for the tax folks out there saying, okay, I really enjoy forensics, but I really wish Dr. Barnes would start talking about controls. Well, the good news is I'm admitting that they're related, but they're not the same thing, okay? They're not the same thing as what we're ultimately trying to come to. All right, moving on to question 5. According to the Audit Board blog piece, what are the key areas of fraud risk assessment should address? All right, so we're getting back to a little bit more of the specific things that we're identifying. So Jenna, what did your group identify here? Okay. So yeah, just a general list there. And so let's explain the difference between the types of fraud that would take place in these areas. And so the simple truth is that these categories generally align with the type of fraud schemes we've already examined. All right. Though we've seen it's possible for a fraud to overlap multiple fraud schemes. So what were the fraud schemes we already talked about? We talked about asset misappropriation, talking about fraudulent financial reporting. We talked about corruption. Now, as Jenner listed out, we got asset misappropriation listed as its own stand-up thing. And then financial and non-financial reporting, we could say that probably loosely falls within fraudulent financial reporting, and it does, okay? And then regulatory compliance areas and illegal acts. Those don't sound like corruption. Those could actually overlap into multiple different areas. I would say corruption probably falls within the illegal act spectrum, but that illegal acts is a lot more broad. In fact, I would say if we were trying to pigeonhole any of these 30 fraud schemes that we talked about before from the ACCT guidance, the occupational fraud and abuse, and try to put them in these categories, there's going to be massive overlaps, maybe with the only exception of asset misappropriation. That seems to be its own standalone thing. All right. Now, that being said, the last part of question 5 says, does the nature of fraud change the importance of a particular step in the fraud risk assessment process? So we're talking about fraud risk assessment and what the steps are, okay? does the category of fraud that's going to be relevant is that going to change the fraud risk assessment steps? And so remember, our fraud risk assessment steps were those 5 steps we talked about that loosely aligned to the COSO framework. So I'm asking, does the type of fraud change the prominence of certain steps? And again, this is a more subjective question. So Leah, what'd your group say on this one?
Some areas I feel like quantifying it is a lot more important than others. If it's like financial accounting, it's easy to quantify, or like you have to be sure to like take the time to quantify versus if it's like there's a giant, I don't know, tractor stolen. That, I mean, it's still important to quantify, but it's like that's
Yeah, and I think that kind of alludes to kind of the example that I was going to work up to, but you and I are thinking along the same lines. So that's good. Yeah, I think the answer is here, yes, is just simply because the nature of fraud is going to change our approach. Now, very simple example, what Leo was kind of leaning on is talking about misappropriation of assets. How long has misappropriation of assets existed in human history? We've never really called it that, okay? You know, probably the cavemen were not kind of like, hey, that's my club. You misappropriated my asset. That's probably not what was going on. But like, if there was theft, that's always existed. So the nature of theft has always existed, and we haven't really needed to adapt to the new circumstances. So if we're talking about a simple asset misappropriation, that's something that's pretty consistent, pretty time driven, and we know what the security protocols are. So controls in a warehouse, we probably don't need to update those. Let's think about something a little bit more modern, okay? What was something we talked about in advanced AIS that's become really, really prominent? The ransomware attacks and cybersecurity, okay? Are those risks kind of evolving and constantly updating? And it's an easy answer. Yes, Dr. Barnes, they are. They're changing. They're constantly evolving, much more than a misappropriation of assets. Misappropriation of assets not really evolved. It's basically, I want this, I take it, okay? Cybersecurity is more along the lines, I've hacked your account, now I own your identity. All right. So the nature of technology has kind of changed our approach for certain types of frauds. What does this mean? Let's think about an example of one of the steps in this the fraud risk assessment. I said we talked about the monitoring step. Is monitoring particularly prominent if we're dealing with a misappropriation of assets fraud? Probably not. Okay. We probably are going to say, well, we need to update controls or security in this area to address that. But the simple truth is we understand how misappropriation of assets occurs. It's somebody taking something they don't own. What about with respect to a cybersecurity fraud? Would that be something that monitoring would need to a little bit more adaptive? Certainly so, because if we're talking about monitoring in that regard, we're saying this is a new and evolving risk. This is a new area where things have changed over time. So we need to be able to adapt as necessary. So this is kind of an allusion to the fact that as things change, our approach to fraud needs to change. Our fraud risk assessment needs to change as necessary. And one thing we're probably going to see is everybody's going to be doing a fraud risk assessment here in just a little bit. The companies that you selected, which hopefully there's not a significant overlap of companies. Hopefully not everybody selected Krusty Krab from SpongeBob. But yeah, if we select these companies, we're going to see differences in fraud risk assessment approaches for the companies based on the risks that they face. All right. According to the audit board blog piece, what are the 7 main fraud risk components? So let's just go ahead and list these off. I believe Megan, you were the group 6 leader. What's your group say for the 7 main fraud risk components?
Occurrence, significance to organization, identification of anti-fraud controls, assessment of control effectiveness, the fraud risk response that are responsible.
Okay. And so then I asked you all to speculate how these components may relate to the steps of the fraud risk assessment you identified in question 2. Can we say there's some relationship here? I certainly hope so. They're part of the same article, so it would probably make sense that there'd be a relationship there. But I alluded to this earlier, is that we can loosely categorize this fraud risk components into the steps of the fraud risk assessment. So remember earlier when we were talking about quantification of risks, what was the terms that I used? I used likelihood of occurrence and significance of occurrence. Those are our significance to organization. Those are actually 2 items that they specifically said in the audit board blog piece were following this step. So we can loosely categorize these risks according to the steps that we're following. And it makes sense. It makes sense to do so simply because we need a framework in which we can assess those risks. So that was kind of the idea behind this piece, is that we know what the risks are. How do we approach those? We walk through the steps of the fraud risk assessment. All right, final question. One conclusion the managers may reach is that fraud risk management and assessment steps we've just discussed are redundant due to their similar controls evaluation. So basically, you're a forensic professional and you're standing next to an audit professional, and the audit professional says, we've just done the COSO framework evaluation and we've updated security. And so the manager says, yeah, forensics professional, we don't need you. See ya. Okay. What are you going to do as a forensics professional to say, the fraud risk management assessment is a separate and valuable process? All right. So how can we justify that? And so I'm just going to briefly call on a few of the groups here. So Matt, what does your group say on this one?
So control evaluation deals primarily with business risks, the external factors, data security, responses to market conditions, may be preventing somebody from accidentally transposing numbers. But they're mostly concerned with business risk, whereas fraud risk management and assessment is more concerned with preventing, detecting, and correcting intentional misstatements committed by people within the company. So you're looking at areas where fraud is going to occur, and you're sort of thinking of responses that wouldn't necessarily be caught by just having really, really, really good controls.
Good. All right. Maddie, you have anything to add on to that? Right. And so I think the ultimate conclusion that I was trying to reach here with this particular question, where I was directing, is that the COSO framework is very, very good if we're just talking about risk in general associated with the organization. And if we kind of say that's a one size fits all, then many people will say, well, we've got all our bases covered. But we do know that fraud can be very, very specific and very, very focused. So the whole goal here is to say, let's not approach things from just a risk mindset, but let's talk about it from a fraud risk mindset. What are the possibilities that can occur specifically related to fraud? If you're concerned about risk, you may not actually be worried that the people that you're working with are consistently colluding to abandon segregation of duties. You may just say, as long as everything gets done properly and we get the job done, it doesn't really matter how we do it. Whereas if you think about it from a fraud risk perspective and understand, if two people have separate responsibilities within the segregation of duties area, kind of collude to work bypass the controls in that area, that is a very, very likely possibility that fraud is occurring within that. Or there's possibility, not likely, but there's certainly a possibility that fraud is occurring there. So the fraud risk perspective is definitely going to be different than just a general risk perspective, and maybe really hard to kind of convince somebody of that. But if you're a manager of an organization, usually what happens in organizations that experience fraud is they don't necessarily put in proper fraud protocols or fraud risk procedures until after they've already suffered a fraud that's taken place. So everybody remember when I talked about my example fraud? I think I've told this story before. My example fraud that I did a fraud risk investigation at a university in Colorado. So everybody remember that story? So the quantification was, what as I said, is the fraud itself was about $2,000. Our fraud investigation and basically the subsequent steps that we took to follow up on this was $20,000. So it cost 10 times as much to correct the problem as if they just basically put in the proper controls in the first place. So fraud risk is something that needs to be kind of on the forethought of the people on the mindset of the people working the organization, not just the idea of risk management, but also specifically fraud risk management. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what the cases are, but we have something we need to take care of before that. So let's go ahead, pause the recording, and we got a quiz we're going to take. You can erase that circle on the board. I didn't even realize that. Well, nobody mentioned it to me, and I was just lecturing with a circle on the middle of the board.
You know us, we decided to pick Monsters Incorporated to assess them.
So for the fraud risk governance, how does it relate to Monsters Inc.? The upper management does not have a fraud management program that encourages a commitment to integrity. So yeah, basically there's no management level in this. It's just this guy who does nothing.
Oh, okay.
But
Is that true of all management though?
no, just Monsters Inc.
Okay.
So the next one for the fraud risk assessment, we said there's no strong consideration for external risks in the company, but there's no internal risks such as collusion. So basically, like these guys, they are very worried about the outside SOC getting in, but then there's nothing internal that they do to prevent them. Which is why Randall is amidst like chaos in Monsters Inc.
So as for control activities, they don't really have very many great ones, which is why Randall was able to fraudulently access systems and areas and gather fear motion things. I haven't seen the movie in a while, so that's why he has access to that. And then as for investigation and corrective action, they don't have anything, but they got lucky. And Sully and Mike accidentally found the problem and they took action, and now Sully's the CEO in the second movie, I think, and so maybe some corrective action can be implemented.
Yeah, so in terms of risk management and monitoring activities, under the old CEO, there was none of that, but now that Sully's in and he sort of knows the dangers of not having good fraud risk management. He can sort of go in, they can take a look at all the areas of Monsters Incorporated that are more likely to have fraud, and he can help set up methods to prevent fraud from happening.
So some potential fraud risks. One big one is that the employees can use company resources to enrich themselves. So like unauthorized access to doors to get unauthorized energy that they can then sell like on the black market. And another potential fraud risk is that the entire company's business model is like very risky and could collapse at any time. It's literally a business model based on fear. So it gives a lot of pressure for management to commit fraud. And then the third one is hiring of unscrupulous personnel that are willing to commit fraud.
So in order to mitigate fraud risk number two, the one of the company being at a tenuous position, what they could do and what they ended up doing was that they could mitigate the risk, the pressure to commit fraud by shifting company activities away from riskier areas of screams, which don't provide as much power, into a more sustainable business practice, such as laughter, because laughter was way stronger than screams were in the movies. And so because they're now in a more stable position business-wise, they're the CEOs, Sully, is going to be under less pressure to commit fraud. We have time for a video, Dr. Barnes.
Sure, as long as we're not too long.
There's no audio.
There's no sound is off. I turned the sound off with my email.
That's all from us. Thank you.
With Mike, nobody appreciates perfect comedic timing. Group two. So Maddie's group.
I know.
We did Oscorp Industries from Spider-Man. First, with the control environment, the main founders are Norman Osborn and Otto Octavius, and basically the two main villains in the movie. Norman was eventually elected mayor of New York City and then installed Oscorp technology throughout the city. He also eventually stopped funding to one of Octavius's company, basically claimed that Octavius had a lot of safety violations, but really he just wanted him to come back to Oscorp. And they both had very different visions of the plan for the business. And then once Norman died, his business passed to his son and Gwen, who weren't really qualified to run the business.
So for the fraud risk assessment, these are the three risks that we identified. Research using humans as test subjects while also using harmful chemicals. Norman himself was injecting this green goo that would make him the Green Goblin. And there are a few other examples, Dr. Octavius with all the tentacles and then venom. Second risk could be hiding research or operations by falsifying financials. And the third, employees could steal classified research, chemicals, or Spider-Man spiders.
For their control activities, they persuaded the board of directors to vote for him when the scientists were obviously questioning his leadership. And then you'd see they kind of go out, the Green Goblin would go out of his way, kill directors if they chose to accept the buyout from their competitor.
That's pretty extreme control right there.
Yeah.
Information communication. Besides Norman himself, the organization was not aware that he was conducting these experiments on himself before human trial. I know before they were like losing funding, so he's like, I'm just going to test it on myself. And there was lack of transparency between employees and executives.
And then for monitoring, there was really no oversight. It was run by executives who ignore and basically act unethically. And then there's no real monitoring of financial or research activities, which allows theft.
The risk we chose was that employees could steal classified research weapons. Their controls, in order to fix this, implement high security, monitor employees' access, biometric pass keys to get in through doors. Monitor those access logs, make sure there's no unusual activity, people aren't going in who shouldn't be. And then just random security checks and make sure they're conducting forensic audits.
That's all.
So we chose the law firm from the TV show Suits.
So looking at fraud risk governance first, this is kind of the tone at the top. So it's a high pressure results driven company that kind of weakens ethical compliance and fraud oversight. So on the outside looking into the company, they're full of prestige and reputation. They only hire Harvard graduated lawyers, and they're always taking on these high profile clients continually. So they have to be reliable. They're always getting the results that are wanted. But on the inside, there's a hidden culture of secrecy, like hiring Mike Ross and just keeping that all a secret, internal power struggles and ethically questionable legal strategies, kind of just to make it happen coming from the partners at the firm. So everyone just does that as well. A big weak internal controls, kind of, we'll talk about it later. They just didn't have a COO, a chief compliance officer, or CCO compliance officer, poor credential verification. And then pressures and incentives, they were just always expected to do the best they could, even if ethics kind of told them not to. And then retaliation of black and whistleblowers, you can see throughout all the partners just do bad things, even if they just do one thing wrong. So let alone if they actually say, oh, this is what's actually happening, I would just be afraid.
So in fraud risk assessment, the areas of any firm that are susceptible to fraud or fraudulent, financial and non-financial reporting, asset misappropriation and corruption, including illegal acts and non-compliance with laws and regulations. This firm seems to have a higher risk, fraud risk and corruption because of the nature of the cases that they handle.
So the three fraud risks we identified: unauthorized practice of
law, like hiring Mike Rouse. And he didn't have a law degree. And then billing fraud and overcharges, a lot of the lawyers were seeing double billing and inflating their hours and charging for services that maybe weren't there. And then client bribery and conflicts of interest. A lot of these lawyers were seen using bribes and just personal information to use against other people to win cases. And we picked to choose billing fraud and overcharging clients. Because 3 ways to help, we could implement automated billing review system, like using AI to track hours and compare these against normal cases to see if any red flags pop up. Or we could introduce third-party billing and just enforce strict billing policies.
And then here's some fraud control activities, or more so the areas of focus that the company should look into. So it doesn't really have a whole lot of internal controls regarding hiring. Seems like Harvey Specter has a lot of say when it comes to hiring, since they did hire Mike Ross without actually vetting him, actually intentionally vetting him. So go to the next one. Lack of controls regarding protection of information. The main IT guy was bribed by Mike to give up information about other members of the firm. Seems like a couple individuals have a little too much power and control over the information within the company. More segregation of duty issues. Donna, Harvey's secretary, basically had access to all the records of the companies and went in and destroyed them without getting caught. She was eventually caught by the firm itself and fired, but not by any other regulatory agencies. And then just a huge internal control, or internal control failure is just Harvey in general. He kind of just stuff nothing stops him. So
Yeah, going on to corrective action, like the reporting and the corrective action that is in place. The lawyers kind of report to their upper managers, which is usually sometimes Harvey, and they kind of end up doing anything with that information and just using it as a personal attack instead of doing the right thing. So there's not really any clear, nobody's doing the right thing. And they only report when they're forced to instead of being proactive about it. And then there's reports of unethical violations that are being covered up in their job. Some tips for them: independent, or need an independent team to oversight for compliance. Ethics training and a secure and anonymous reporting system would help. And just clear reporting lines to who they're supposed to report to, and make sure that that person is doing the right thing. The next one is for monitoring and review. Monitoring ensures fraud controls remain effective and new ones are quite quickly identified. Some risks that they need to monitor are unlicensed attorneys engaging in conflict of interest business or personal business, and then just, using the wrong documents that they aren't supposed to have. Some tips: they could do annual compliance reviews on all attorneys and certifications, review randomly selected cases, internal audits, external audits, and some ethical training is much needed.
Is that a black screen or is that the air?
That's the answer.
Okay, just verify.
Impression of this TV show would be a lot less interesting if there was a strict control. Suits with internal controls. Yeah. The Green Arrow is actually starting out.
So we did Wayne Enterprises specifically from the Christian Bale movies.
So looking at the control environment, we said that it was very weak because Bruce Wayne, he's an absentee owner. He just kind of gives all control to Lucas Fox, who's Morgan Freeman, doesn't really care about the company except for using its resources as Batman to accomplish his goals. The other chairman, they don't seem to recognize that Batman is using their technology and their devices to stop crime. They're kind of oblivious. The risk assessment, we said that that's very high risk because of the nature of the assets being misappropriated, which are weapons, basically. Control activities, we said that they were very poor. There's a lack of segregation of duties. Bruce Wayne and Lucas Fox, I mean, they kind of, there's some collusion there. They're basically running the show. Lucas Fox is able to get all these discontinued prototypes for Bruce Wayne to use as Batman. Anybody who wants to whistleblow Coleman Reese, they're either intimidated by Bruce Wayne or Lucas Fox or killed by the Joker. Information and communication, very poor. It seems like the whole board of governors is just oblivious that their technology is being used by Batman.
And then monitoring activities, we also said that was pretty poor. It's really pretty much non-existent because Bruce Wayne can pretty much use the company assets however he wants without any of like the other employees or board members knowing what he's doing.
Yeah, so potential fraud risk factors. These are the ones that's probably already going on, such as asset misappropriation, Bruce Wayne, or pretending Batman stealing the weapons and using it for his personal endeavors, which is saving the Gotham. And then some financial, non-financial reporting. I think there's a lack of transparency of what they're using their resources for, and this include issues, which would include issues in reporting their expenses when he's blowing up their weapons, etc. And then some, like Mouse mentioning, some collusion with what's his name, Lucius Fox, yeah, and Batman, basically to use it for his vigilantism. So it's enforcing justice without legal authority. Yeah.
And then so the risks that we chose to provide recommendations for was the asset misappropriation and misuse of company assets. So our recommendations pretty much would prevent Batman from doing all that he does. So the first is to have inventory controls, like increased security and even tracking on like their high risk or high valued assets. Better segregation of duties of who has access to company assets. Requiring board approval for repurposed technology. So like his, I think it was called the Tumbler that he has, that was like an old military vehicle. So having board approval to be able to use that for another purpose. And then implementing better whistleblower protection, essentially calling up Superman.
I've seen The Dark Knight probably a dozen times. It's the first time I've ever thought of the Joker as an anti-whistleblowing mechanism.
Oh. We did ours over Gusto's from Ratatouille.
So for fraud risk governance, basically throughout the whole movie, a lot of the plot is that this guy, Skinner, is more concerned with profits and like rather than quality, like he was trying to release all the branded frozen foods kind of without like approval from all of like the chefs that are actually in the restaurant. He was hiding documents about like who the rightful owner of the restaurant is. So he was kind of like illegally like running the restaurant essentially. And he's just like a mean guy and a bad attitude, so.
Next was fraud risk assessment. Overall, they don't have a great risk assessment because there was rats just coming in and running this place. I feel like they probably should have had measures in place for that. But our three risks were bribery of critics to inflate ratings. These are kind of more just like, I guess, risks for any restaurant, but there could be theft of inventory and then a wrongful use of credit card information. There's thinking like in a restaurant, if your like waiter just takes your credit card, they could easily just take a picture of this. So like, these didn't happen like for sure in the movie, but these are just pretty obvious risks for us, restaurants in general. So we chose to focus on the theft of inventory because this is the one that actually happened in the movie. The rats went in and stole a bunch of food. And that's a big issue because they were losing inventory, but basically, some ways to prevent this is to have some physical safeguards, like freezers and pantries that lock, maybe only giving certain individuals access that aren't rats, doing regular inventory counts, and then checking the employee rat's background. And as you can see, Remy ended up being a good rat, but his family initially were bad rats, then they learned, but still, rat background checks should be very good.
So the control activities, you said that there could be like time cards for employees, so like if you're going in, clock in, clock out, like who's on the premises. Inventory counts, so like they would have like noticed that like all of the grapes went missing whenever his brother ate all the grapes. And segregation of duties, especially for payroll and procurement, and then implementing food safety precautions. So if the rats weren't the employees, they would definitely want pest control. But in the situations where they are employees, it's different.
All right, so for the fraud investigation and corrective action, a big part of this is going to be the information and communication. So just ensuring that all the employees are like aware of rules, so like don't befriend a rat and let them come in and steal stuff. That's rule number one. Have regular employee check-ins, like make sure the rules make sense and that they're like working and efficient. And making sure that the rules and regulations are easy to understand. And then lastly, for the fraud risk management, just like monitoring activities, so like having cameras in place to make sure the controls are working. You gotta have key cards to make sure only certain people are accessing things, like maybe you have a supply closet and like only the sous chef has a key card for that. And then ensuring all physical safeguards are still operating effectively. So if there's like locks on doors, just like making sure that those are still able to be locked and unlocked. And then keeping up to date with the FTA regulations.
That's it.
Okay, so we're doing our presentation on the mystery shack from Gravity Falls. It's pretty much just like a gift shop. So first, it's run by Stanley Pines, and he's pretty unethical. He upcharges all of his souvenirs, and they have like exhibits and stuff like that for like all the supernatural things that happen in Gravity Falls, and all of it's fake, and he's pretty much just trying to dupe all of his customers and like take their money. And he's also like many times admitted to committing tax fraud. And one of my favorite quotes, when there's no cops around, anything's legal. So obviously this leads to his employees not really taking his business seriously. Like they leave like throughout like the middle of their shift and like just let chaos ensue.
So we identified three main risks. We started with misappropriation of assets, then financial, non-financial reporting, and illegal acts, all of which are fairly prevalent throughout the show, but we wanted to focus on the misappropriation of assets and just kind of general lack of controls. So currently, the only controls that they have in place is the passcode to the mystery basement. There's a locked safe in the office and security cameras in the gift shop, but we think that they could improve so many ways, like always having an adult manager on duty. In one episode, Stan leaves and leaves his 13-year-old niece in charge. That's not legal. Having physical locks to block off like the house section of the shack from the gift shop and like the museum floors, physical counts of inventory, and then better just tracking overall.
Yeah, so we said that the first step really to fix this issue is just to get rid of Grunkle, as you will, as the CEO. And then implement the suggested controls. And then for monitoring, we said consider hiring an auditor and, maybe form a board of directors and, or have a business partner to help run things.
Some interesting takeaways from these presentations. I think some of these TV shows and movies would be a lot less interesting if there were proper controls in place, so. Although I'm a little bit iffy on the idea that it's okay for a rat to be in the restaurant as long as it's an employee, yeah. All right, see you all on Tuesday.